Something huge has just happened between China and Russia. Now, if you want to control a house, you don't need to own the whole thing if you think about it. You just need a tap. What I mean by that is that that's the story behind Russia's brand new project involving China, the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Moscow says this deal will rescue its gas industry, redirect flows from Europe, its long dependent market, to China, and therefore secure a market for the next 30 years. But there's a problem with that, and here it is. The pipe is signed on paper. The tap isn't on. There are no fixed prices, no firm volumes, no construction timetable, not even a final contract. And so that's where the real power lies, in what we see versus what's actually behind the substance. So in this video, I wanted to unpack exactly what this deal is about, why Beijing seems to have all the leverage, and how it reveals just how far Russia's position has collapsed, including Putin's personal growing desperations for alternative options.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where we're currently coming to you from London. Now, we've been covering a lot on this channel, diplomatic activities, especially involving Putin, Modi, Xi, including at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which you can find on the channel, and also the military parade that China held in Beijing, of which Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, was attending. Now, in that other video, I emphasized why I think it's a much bigger deal than people might think it is, and also for one particular reason, which is that during it, President Xi and President Putin rolled out what they called a, quote, legally binding memorandum between two major companies, statewide companies, Russia's Gazprom and China's CNPC. Russia's Gazprom CEO, Alexei Miller, called it, quote, the largest, most capital-intensive project in the global gas industry. Now, on paper, it's massive. 50 billion cubic meters, or BCM, of gas a year. That's running from Russia's Arctic Yamal fields through Mongolia into northern China. A 30-year supply line. And that's in addition to the 38 BCM, or billion cubic meters, already flowing through the original Power of Siberia pipeline that opened about 6 years ago. So it's meant to look like a salvation for the Kremlin. But as always, the devil is in the details. And this is where the crux is. Now, it's a bit of an illusion of progress. Russia and China have advanced plans for this long-delayed pipeline, but the core terms remain yet again unresolved, a sign of Beijing's growing leverage. After these talks in Beijing, indeed, Moscow claimed some form of victory, a binding memorandum to build this Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. But what it left out is pretty crucial. No agreement on pricing. And this was the sticking point when I first covered this a couple of years ago. And it is, well, unsurprisingly, the single most critical piece. Pricing was the sticking point for more than a decade of negotiations, just as it was for Power of Siberia 1 11 years ago. Beijing has even pushed for paying close to Russia's domestic subsidized rates, which would be a humiliating concession for Moscow. Today, even after a so-called binding memorandum, there is still no agreed formula, proof that China is deliberately keeping the pressure on. And the wrong kind of gas pressure, as you'd probably know what I mean. No clarity on financing, who pays what is still in dispute. No settled timetable for construction either. China, with multiple natural gas suppliers, can afford to wait, actually. Russia, meanwhile, cut off from its primary source of European buyers, cannot. And indeed, a spokesman from China's foreign ministry said blandly that cooperation was, quote, practical, which is diplomatic code for we'll buy when and if it suits us. One of the biggest, starkest illustrations of how the Chinese ultimately see the Russo-Sino relationship as one of pragmatism, not one based purely on morals or united ideals. Now, of course, Western sanctions that came into play even more than they were after Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine completely pushed Russia into Beijing's arms. Europe was Russia's biggest market. And, well, over time, they have been trying to phase out Russian energy entirely, aiming for 2027. Exports to Europe have already collapsed from about 157 BCM in 2021 to 39 in 2025. So to keep its petrodollars flowing, Russia has had to reroute oil and gas to China, to India, and many other nations. But that, of course, has created a lopsided dependency. Beijing supplies not just cash, but also optics, microelectronics, drone engines, and dual-use tech that feeds Putin's war machine. And here is the brutal arithmetic. Some analysts estimate that the Power of Siberia 2 might generate $2 to $4.5 billion annually. Compare that to the $20 billion Russia would make from Europe. So yes, even if this pipeline is built, it will not ever compensate and fill that financial hole. But to really understand why Moscow is willing to swallow unfavorable terms, we need to rewind just a little bit. You see, for decades, Europe was Russia's golden goose. From the Cold War onwards, pipelines like Druzhba and Nord Stream cemented Moscow's role as the energy supplier to the continent. The Soviet Union and later Russia itself leveraged gas not just as revenue but also political influence, something we saw happen a lot over the 2000s with the boom in oil. Even every winter, European governments worried about the tap potentially being turned off, and then when Nord Stream 1 and 2 came online, Moscow believed that it basically locked in complete energy dominance for a generation. It became the sort of energy hegemon of Europe or Eurasia more broadly. But of course, that dominance was fragile. It rested on political trust that collapsed with Putin's growing exertion and influence over, well, Georgia, Moldova, and of course, Ukraine. And so overnight, the European Union accelerated diversification, importing LNG, investing in renewables, and pledging to phase out Russian energy completely by 2027. Russia thought Europe couldn't live without its gas. The past 3 years have proven, well, while some countries have continued to import it, that there is an overall aggregate reduction. Now contrast that with China. Beijing has studied Europe's scramble and knows it can flip that script. Instead of being dependent, it can dictate the terms because Russia has no other options. That's the reversal we're witnessing right now. From Moscow as the indispensable supplier to Moscow as the desperate seller. And this is evident from the prices that you see them being sold to India, China, and then even some cases where India has been reselling it to Europe at original prices, making a profit on Russia's own energy. Now, I'm curious again what you think about this, and do consider subscribing if you find these sorts of straight to the point, no BS approaches that I try to give on the channel, well, newsworthy. Now, Beijing, meanwhile, can take its time. We know the gradualist approach that China approaches to foreign policy and just generally development and mindset. It has had a, well, informal 20% cap on imports from any single supplier. That alone limits Russia's role. And, well, it has abundant LNG supply from the Middle East, especially the Iranians, Qatar, Australia, and even the United States to an extent. It is also racing ahead on renewables and decarbonization, narrowing Russia's window further every year and its relevancy. Even the war in the Middle East, which threatened energy stability, only actually nudged Beijing to reconsider diversification, not to rush to Moscow as an alternative. And then look at that trade balance. Russia depends on China for a third of its total trade, not a specific sector. But China's trade with Russia, in its entirety, doesn't even reach 5%. This is not a partnership of equals, it's hierarchy. And here's where the story gets biggest of all, much bigger than Russia. Because if the Power of Siberia 2 materializes, China could import over 100 BCM of Russian gas by 2030, more than 1/5 of its projected demand. That would tip its balance away from LNG and towards pipeline. But Beijing doesn't want to be too dependent on anyone, including Moscow. And that's why it has poured investment into domestic gas exploration, rising output from about 190 BCM in 2020 to 245 last year, already exceeding its 5-year plan target. At the same time, China has actually become the world's largest LNG importer, bringing in about 79 million tons. And that's just, well, a fraction compared to what Russia feels it needs to get in terms of sales. And so if Russia ramps up pipeline supply, China can simply use that leverage even further, squeezing, say, well, not just Russia, but the US, Qatar exporters on price, or turning down LNG when spot prices spike, for example. In other words, the Kremlin's desperation is giving Beijing a new lever not just over Russia, but over potentially Washington, Doha, entire global energy markets. And all because Russia itself is running out of actions because of Putin's choices in Ukraine. Indeed, Gazprom has already suggested payments for the project could be split between yuan and rubles. But that's not just a pricing issue. It's a direct challenge to the primacy of the United States dollar in global energy trade, for example. And let's not forget, of course, the geopolitical theatre. The announcement was staged at one of the largest summits in history of the SCO, and, well, an opportunity for Putin to be re-legitimized. So in the longer term, whilst this is a massive problem for Putin, potentially, in the short run, he can sort of try to indicate that he isn't isolated and that Russia has options, but not great ones. And no one in the Kremlin, especially in the central bank areas and monetarian economists and such, they're not going to be chairing this deal, mainly because it isn't a deal. It's just a commitment, an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, which ultimately does nothing. For Beijing, it's a signal that it won't bow to Western pressure. And so while Moscow sells a lifeline, Beijing quietly yet again positions itself as the world's ultimate swing player in gas in many areas, a country that can toggle between domestic output, LNG, and most crucially for this channel, and what we focus on largely about Russia, pipeline to keep, well, everyone else off balance. Optimists in Moscow say a final contract could come in 2025, and Gazprom claims construction might take 3 years later. But the truth is simple. Beijing decides if and when. As someone else put it, Russia is at the mercy of the Chinese. Plain and simple. Moscow may boast the memorandums, but Beijing holds the timetable, the effect of purse strings, and ultimately when that tap is turned on or off. Now, if you enjoyed that, then do consider subscribing and let me know again what you think about this development in the comments below. My name is Pyotr Kurzin. I'm a mixture of Russian and English, having been brought up in the West with strong influences from the Slavic world. I've done my master's at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and I've specialized in trying to bring an internationalist perspective, trying to understand how Russia is viewed in the West, but also outside the West, and also covering geopolitical issues across the globe, including the people that I engage with, from diplomats, journalists, to activists, and even, well, some many great content creators. If that resonates with you, I look forward to seeing you join us in the future conversations on the Global Gambit. Till then, take care.